Hi, this is Christy Martin, and I listen to the Ringside Boxing Show.
Live from Monterey on California's beautiful Central Coast, this is the Ringside Boxing Show. I'm Dennis Taylor welcoming you to join me and my expert analysts, Travis Hartman, Rizwan Zahid, and John J. Responsi today and every week for the hottest, sweatiest show on the West Coast. And now, from Studio 1A, it's the Ringside Boxing Show. Hey, welcome to the Ringside Boxing Show on the Grueling Truth Sports Network, where we're going to take you back a few decades today and talk about a very colorful legend during the second half of today's show. Before we had Tyson Fury singing Aerosmith songs to his girlfriend, or Mike Tyson threatening to eat an opponent's children, or Muhammad Ali spouting poetry, there was Max Baer, who was the most feared heavyweight in the world during his heyday. Madcap Maxie, they called him. He was a heavyweight champion from 1934 to 1935, and he was blamed right or wrong for 2 ring deaths. And he was a friend. He was friendly with a colorful variety of people, from Hollywood stars to mobster, and actually at the peak of his career, he also became a movie star, and even had a leading role in a movie called The Prize Fighter and the Lady. So in just a few minutes, John J. Responsi and I will be interviewing Colleen Aycock, who's the author of a sensational new biography entitled The Magnificent Max Baer, The Life of the Heavyweight Champion and Film Star. This book paints a really vivid portrait, not only of one of the most charismatic fighters in history, but also a very colorful era in the sport, the 1930s. So you're going to enjoy this conversation and hang with us for that. Before that, we're going to be hearing from our British correspondent, Paul McLaughlin, who's going to catch us up on the stuff that's been going on across the Atlantic in the UK. And we'll open, as always, by checking in with our expert analysts on the week in boxing. Travis Hartman is a professional boxer, trainer, and promoter from Osborne, Missouri. He's now living and training in Orlando, Florida. Rizwan Zahid's a boxing journalist from Toronto. John J. Responsi is chief lead writer for MaxBoxing.com and DogHouseBoxing.com. And John and I are co-authors of Intimate Warfare, the true story of the Arturo Gatti and Mickey Ward boxing trilogy, an Amazon bestseller. It's got about a 4.75 rating from reviewers on Amazon. So check that book out. You're going to enjoy it. Hey, Travis, the bad news is that your fight with Daryl Cunningham in Detroit fell through. The good news is that you immediately got offered another one. This one's in Wichita against an undefeated prospect. His name's Peter Dobson. He's 10-0 with 6 knockouts. He's from the Bronx. He's 28 years old, and he is the 17th undefeated fighter you've faced in your career. Give us the details. What do you know about this guy? Anything?
I know that he's about to get the best Travis Hartman that you've ever seen. So it's not going to be good for him, I don't think. But it's pretty good. I mean, this the way the boxing game goes. I mean, I feel like fights fall through all the time for numerous reasons. But I'm blessed enough to get an opportunity literally a week later than when I was supposed to. And this fight gets to be back home, and it's also being televised by Showtime. So there's a small chance that my fight will be shown. I mean, especially if I pull off an upset, that definitely will be throwing my fight on there for sure. So I'm really gunning for that, and I'm very hopeful for that. But as for the 17th undefeated guy, I was sitting back last night watching those fights at the Barclays Center on Fox, and I fought 3 of the guys that fought on that card. I fought
Really? Who?
Keith Thurman. I fought Miguel Cruz, and I fought Cordell Booker. All 3 of those guys all fought last night on that card. So I was just shaking my head at myself, to be honest. I mean, I'm not really bragging about that, but it's just a fact that I've fought all of these guys, and it's just I shake my head thinking about it, and I fought all of those guys, not even close to being 100% prepared. So that's why I kind of shake my head. And this fight coming up February 15th for me, though, when Peter Dobson, like I said, I'm not bragging at all. I'm not talking smack or anything, but I'm genuinely, this is going to be the best that I've ever been, because I've genuinely had almost 5 weeks of training, and a week of that training I was in Colorado. So I'm taking this fight 100% serious. I've been sparring over at Keith Thurman's gym in St. Petersburg, Florida. So I'm coming 100% prepared. So, I mean, it's going to be a great fight. It's going to be an amazing fight. And I'm definitely gunning for, one of the biggest upsets of my career. So I'm totally ready for this. And I really, like I said, I feel blessed that I got another opportunity after the one fell through. But Peter Dobson is definitely going to get the best Travis Hartman February 15th.
How many times in your career, 40-plus fights, have you had a 5-week training camp?
To be honest, 0, Dennis. I had 4 weeks for the Jorge Paez Jr. fight on HBO. And as you can see, you watch that fight, I lost a very, very competitive 4-round decision, which a lot of people thought could have easily been a draw. Speaking of which, Sean Gibbons, who he works with Manny Pacquiao, he jumped in the ring in Atlantic City right after my fight with Jorge Paez Jr. and it was like, oh, my God, that should have been a draw. So it just shows you that I can fight. I am talented. I had 170 amateur fights in the amateurs, and then I've had 43 pro fights now. And I could tell you that I've definitely learned a lot. I'm 35 now. And it's crazy, but I've always been a late bloomer, and I really feel like I feel the best I've ever felt. I'm in the best shape that I've ever been in. I've really learned how to train for professional boxing matches later in my career, and now they've actually given me the opportunity to train. And honestly, I'm blessed for it. I'm grateful for it, but I think they made a really big mistake by giving me this long to train. But I'm definitely going to take full advantage of it, and like I said, I'm going to go out there and leave it all in the ring, that's for sure.
Way awesome, man. Fantastic.
Yep.
All right. Hey, guys, Keith Thurman's first opponent in 22 months was a guy we're real familiar with, the Riverside Rocky. He's always been kind of just under that top echelon of fighters, but he's never been anything except formidable in the ring. And Josesito Lopez gave Thurman the hard rounds that he probably needed and wanted. Josesito got knocked down by a huge punch in that second round, but Thurman got buzzed in the 7th, and Thurman won on 2 scorecards, 117-109 and 115-111. The third judge had a 113-113, a draw, even with that knockdown. Riz, which card was closest to your own?
Difficult question to answer. I'm going to say I think a draw is a little out of the question, but to say that Lopez won 4, maybe even 5 rounds, I don't think that's much of a surprise. And I think it's I don't know with all 3 judges, but I think one of them gave it round 7 to Lopez as a 10-8 round, and I'm in full agreement with that because Thurman at moments looked out on his feet. And I don't think Lopez even thought he won the fight. I think he said, round 7 I had my chance and I kind of let it go. But the story of this fight is not so much the fight, but it's is this we saw the good, the bad, and the ugly from Thurman. Is this how he is now? Is this just ring rust? Is it is this has the layoff just done him wrong for so many reasons? And where does he stand in the welterweight division? Because this is I don't know if I'm assessing a grade for him, it's definitely not what we expected. There's moments early where he looked great with the knockdown, and the rest of that fight I said there's no way this guy beats Errol Spence. There's no way this guy beats Terence Crawford. He's talking a Pacquiao fight, and I think that's a very intriguing fight because, funny enough, the 40-year-old in Pacquiao has actually been more active. And I think based on last night's performance, it wouldn't shock me if Pacquiao was listed as a favorite.
Wow, really? Okay, John, you wrote about this fight on Max Boxing, and I think you had it 116-111. How did you think Thurman looked, considering he's been idle for 2 years?
I'm in agreement with Riz. I thought he looked real good in the beginning. It was like a fight of 2 halves, 6 rounds and 6 rounds. For the first 6, he was winning easily, doing pretty much everything he wanted to do. And Lopez is not named the Riverside Rocky for nothing. I mean, he is full of grit and determination. And, yeah, he really knocked Thurman all over the ring. I mean, I was kind of stunned. I was stunned myself. I was buzzed watching it in the 7th because I didn't think that would happen to Thurman in that fight, and I don't think I've ever seen him get hit so solidly in all the fights that I've watched. So I was trying to write and watch, and I was just going, oh my, this is not good because he really did look hurt, and then It made me think a little back to a couple of other fights where he got hurt. You remember the Collazo fight? He got hurt with a body shot, and he was hanging on and got out of it, and then the Robert Guerrero fight, if you guys remember, he was dominating that fight. And then I think it was the 10th round, Guerrero got him in the corner and just started beating him up. And it's kind of a strange little pattern we have going here. And it didn't happen against Danny Garcia so much or Sean Porter because they're so close in talent, but I don't know. It really surprised me, and I thought he won. That my score was pretty handily. When I heard the majority decision, I just groaned. I thought I couldn't see 113, even though the only argument you could make, I guess, is that Lopez was the aggressor. But Harold Letterman used to use a term called effective aggressiveness, and he was effective at times. But Thurman was outboxing him in almost every round, from what I could see. So I would have only, if I had to grade Keith Thurman, I'd only give him a C, because an A in the first half and a D in the in the second, and he showed a great heart, and like not a surprise because he's tough and he's determined also. But I don't know, it was just strange to me that happened. Not taking anything away from Josesito, but I figured that Keith Thurman would win by a knockout, and I think he did too. I think he was surprised. I think if the knockdown had occurred earlier in round 2, Thurman might have got him out of there, but he had to really hang on and use all his cleverness and guile and legs saved him in the 7th round, and he got hit with a few more shots in round 8. So an uneven performance, to say the least, and I'm sure he is probably shaking his head too. Thurman is very honest, and that's one of the things I really appreciate him. We love having him on our show, Dennis, because he's such a articulate kid and everything, and you don't hear a lot of fighters admit they got buzzed and that they were hurt, and he admitted it. And because it's such a macho sport, and I wasn't hurt. Well, you were staggering all over the place. That doesn't matter. I wasn't hurt at all. But he was feeling it, and Lopez was a 35-1 underdog in that fight, and I was thinking about that later, about whoever put money on Lopez was probably going bonkers in the 7th round. Yeah. So that's the thing, though. If anybody's stock went up, it was Lopez, and Thurman's went down a little bit. I agree again with Riz. I can't see him hanging in there with Spence at this point, or Terence Crawford, because he'll do good for a while and then he'll get caught, and one of these guys is going to get him. Lopez isn't even a real hard puncher, and he had him wobbling and definitely hurt. So if I'm Keith Thurman, that's a wake-up call, and whether he's this way from now on. I remember when Andre Ward came back, and a lot of my friends were saying, well, he's not the same that he once was. And it's true. When you're off that long, it does take something away. I don't know if that's the case with Thurman. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that, look, the rust got him a little bit, and Lopez definitely got him. So it's going to be interesting to see how he looks in his next fight. And I like the Pacquiao fight, too. I think that's a good fight. I don't think Pacquiao would necessarily win it. But if that Thurman fight, if he fights like he did last night, Pacquiao can definitely win.
Yeah. Travis, how do you like that matchup, Pacquiao and Thurman, especially considering what Thurman's already talking like, well, that was his tune-up, and he's ready for Pacquiao next. If he fights Pacquiao next, could he be in trouble?
Well, to be honest, the good and the bad about last night was that the good is he didn't look good. And that is, it's good because Pacquiao is looking for paydays, but Pacquiao is also looking for paydays against an opposition that's not really a killer, so to speak. So I think Keith Thurman really jumped up on the opponent list for Manny Pacquiao because of that performance, because I think Pacquiao is seeing an undefeated, highly regarded younger, a welterweight world champion. And I think that with that resume and those I guess you could say ratings that Keith Thurman has got, because he fought on regular TV now, so he's ready for a bigger fight. And I think that he might get that Pacquiao fight, to be honest. And if he does, guys, this is my observation of Keith last night, because I got to finish up his training camp with him over there. And we had some long talks after training camp at the gym. And I can tell you guys right now that Keith Thurman knew. And he didn't admit it on TV, obviously, but privately, me and him, Keith Thurman knew that he was probably 75% of who he actually is going into this fight. His confidence level and everything. His training camp, he's like, he's like, I got a lot of rust. I'm not 100%. This hasn't been the best training camp I've ever had. I'm just kind of getting back into it. And I predicted the fight was going to go the distance from the get-go just because of getting a feel from talking to Keith in person. And Keith is a very honest fighter, and he's definitely more honest with me because I'm a fighter too. We were kind of talking just between the two of us. But he wanted to stop Josesito because that's what all the big-time fighters have done. So the Keith Thurman camp was looking to stop Josesito, but a 75% Keith Thurman still beats a guy like Josesito, and that's not to take anything from Josesito because I think he fought better than he's ever fought in a really long time last night, and he just couldn't close the show on Keith because Keith's a tough and gritty guy. And two things I was kind of shocked about with that fight last night. One was Keith actually looked tremendously sharp and on point, and that check left hook was like such an on-point punch when he knocked down Josesito early that I was just like, wow, Keith looks really good. But that later on down the stretch, I really think you've seen the rust kind of setting in. I mean, he was out of the ring for 22 months, guys, and coming off of an injury. So it's hard for me to give a 100% Keith Thurman grade for last night. Because, last night, it was what it was. He came away with the win, and I think that that's the most positive thing he can take away from that because I don't think even he was expecting to look phenomenal. He wanted to, that's absolutely for sure, but I don't even think he was expecting to. And to be honest, he didn't, getting hurt like he was hurt. I've never seen Keith Thurman that hurt. And if that would have been a bigger puncher like a Crawford or a Spence, they would have gotten Keith Thurman out of there. But that wouldn't have been the same Keith Thurman either. So it's hard to make that comparison because that Keith Thurman would have been prepared and would have had more fights under his belt coming back if he's fighting a Crawford or a Spence. He wouldn't have looked like that because it would have been a total different lead up to all of that, etc. So it's not really a good comparison. But if a Crawford or a Spence would have hit Thurman the way that Josesito was, I think, in that 6th or 7th round, yes, for sure. Thurman would have been knocked out because Josesito is not the biggest puncher out there, but Josesito was catching him so clean. I've never seen Thurman's head rock back as much as it was. It looked like a bungee almost. Like it was like popping in the air, and like Josesito was kind of chasing him around the ring and hitting with punches. Josesito was kind of reaching for those punches, so a lot of those punches, they weren't even full power from Josesito, but it was still knocking Thurman's head way back, which was, to me, I think that was more of the rust again, maybe not seeing a lot of punches coming at you, maybe not absorbing a lot of big punches, even through the training camp. So I personally, as a fighter, and obviously, I've become a good friend of Keith's now too, but I give him a little bit of a pass, meaning that this was a tune-up. It was a great tune-up. You got one hell of a fighter in the Riverside Rocky who definitely pushed you to the limit and beyond, and you still found a way to come out with the victory, even though the night could have easily ended for him, guys, in the 7th round. Josesito, for the entire round, it seemed like, was pummeling him. I'd never seen him take as many punches like that, clean punches, in a really long time. So I was on the edge of my seat watching that fight, in that 7th round when Josesito almost got him out of there. But Keith came back that next round, and he looked like 100% better. He was sharp. His hands were up. He was moving a little better. So he rebounded. I hope that he learned from this fight, and I think he did. He got it out of the way. And I want to see him in a big fight. And honestly, the Pacquiao fight's a perfect fight, I think. I give Keith the edge, but I think it would be a hell of a fight because another thing, 40-year-old Manny Pacquiao, he looked phenomenal to me against Adrian Broner. He really did. He looked great. His offensive output was phenomenal. I hadn't seen Pacquiao throw that many punches in a long time. So I think we would get an amazing fight, and I would be all for it. I think it's a great fight. But the only thing I would say is if Keith Thurman wins that fight against Pacquiao, his next fight has to be against a Spence or a Crawford or somebody of that nature for me to really give Keith the benefit that he deserves. And honestly, guys, I think it is, I can't remember what the exact stat was, but Keith Thurman was the first welterweight to unify the titles in like 30-something years back when he did it. So, Keith Thurman's up there. Keith Thurman, he deserves to be in the talk still. He's only had one bad fight. The kid's undefeated, and his bad fight was last night, and he still won. So it's not a bad fight to have because he still won that bad fight. He wasn't 100%. So I still see him up there, but it's very, very understandable that all of the boxing people and the boxing fans seen that fight and would say that a Crawford or a Spence would definitely annihilate him. It's a fair assumption, but I just don't think we've seen 100% Keith Thurman last night.
Well, hey, DAZN also had a real interesting main event. Jaime Munguia won a real war against this guy Takeshi Inoue, who's the younger brother of the monster, Naoya Inoue.
Yeah.
Munguia is now 32-0, 26 knockouts, and people are talking about him as a possible threat down the road to Canelo and the other top middleweights like Demetrius Andrade, and he's already kind of calling out Andrade right now. The remarkable thing to me, Riz, is he's just 21 years old. For now, it sounds like he's planning to stay at junior middleweight, but it sounds like he also had trouble making the 154-pound weight for last night's fight. So moving to 160 doesn't sound all that far off to me, especially if a big opportunity presents itself. Does he look like he belongs in the conversation already with somebody like Andrade, for example? Are you there? Did we lose Riz? Yeah, it looks like we lost Riz. John, what do you think about that?
Well, what I didn't get to see a lot of the fight, Dennis, but what I saw, the first thing that popped into my brain was that this guy's not going to have a very long career. You know, he takes so many punches. He's exciting as hell, don't get me wrong, but he's a player because he can punch. He's young, he's athletic, but I wish he'd work on his defense a little bit. It was a rock'em sock'em fight. So sure, he's got to be put in the equation, and he moves up in weight. He's got to move up in weight because I'm sure he's still growing. That whoever he fights, he's going to give hell. But I think that's probably what his team is thinking is we probably got 5 years with this guy, and then all those wars that he's going to be in, they're going to start taking a toll on him. So yeah, he's going to move up. He's a tough kid, and he fights hard. He doesn't duck, but it makes it exciting for the fans. And I saw probably 3 or 4 rounds, and I was just shaking my head at the way they were trading shots. Fans were going crazy, and that's fine. But he's got to be considered because he's a big kid, and he's a strong kid, and he punches hard. So yeah, he's got to be. But his flaws are obvious, and he's going to run into somebody that's going to really pop him hard. I mean, he got hit hard last night, but really hard. So it's just going to be like that. You know, it's going to be kind of a roller coaster ride with Munguia, but still, it's going to be one exciting one.
I think we got Riz back now. Riz, what was your take on Munguia? What do you think of this guy?
I mean, he's still so young, but I mean, like you're saying, I don't think his career is going to last long. He doesn't seem like a guy who's going to go and fight till his mid-30s, or at least not at the top level. It's just the way, like every fight's going to be a war, and he's going to win a lot of them. 160 might be dangerous for him though, and not because he won't cause other fighters problems, but the guys he's fighting are just going to be bigger and stronger. And when a guy whose whole impact in the sport is because of his size and strength, when you're going up against the bigger boys, it's harder. It's harder to impose your will. Everything becomes a little harder. And I don't think his skills are there yet where he's going to, go up to 160 and just box the bigger guys. I don't think that's going to happen yet. It seems like De La Hoya's pushing for him to fight Charlo in Houston. I think that's a great fight because I think, we've seen, I get it. He's only 21, but I think this is what he is. So he's not I don't think we look at him as a prospect anymore, right? He brutalized Saddam Ali. He beat Liam Smith quite handedly, scored a knockdown, and what's amazing, he's able to throw so many punches. I think that's, it's to be 21 again, right? But, he's throwing nearly 1,000 punches a fight. So because of that, he's going to be dangerous for anyone, but he has little to no defense. And again, I think he can get better with that. There's a lot of potential there with him. Regardless of what happens, though, he's going to be in some fun fights. But I would love to see him against Charlo. I think he needs to take that next leap in competition. Inoue was obviously a very good fighter and strong, but, I don't think he's like a top 5 kind of guy. But I think if we're talking about where Munguia stands in that division, I think we're going to say he's probably top 5. So because of that, I feel like he can, and because of his size, I think he can beat most of the other fighters in that division. I think 160, I think is a little too early to talk about it, but the problem is if he's having trouble making 154, that move's going to happen, and it might be, if he gets too big for one division, he's too small for another, that's going to cause him a lot of problems. Because he's a big dude. Like, he's probably entering the ring close to 180. And if he goes up to 160 again, the guys they're going to be bigger, they're stronger, they're guys who are cutting from 185. So it's going to be a lot more difficult. I think the idea is in a couple of years, if he keeps winning and Canelo's what Canelo is now, that those two can have a massive fight in Mexico or one of the areas with the high Hispanic population like LA, and that's great. But I mean, one thing at a time. And I think he has to, we see all the tools, the potential in him, and he's getting. You're not going to be too harsh on the guy because he's 21 and he just keeps winning and he's still winning point-handedly. But you want to see him take that next step. And I think part of it though is, the guys who have that size and strength, they're not going to be very disciplined when they're not fighting someone, that they're not fearing the guy's power. I think if he fights Charlo, I think we can actually see what he's fully capable of. Because I don't think he fights Charlo the same way he fought last night. I think he'll be, the first 30 seconds of that fight, I saw him pumping a jab out, and then that was kind of non-existent the rest of the way. I think if he's fighting a top-level fighter, that will change. So I'm hoping he fights Charlo next, and then I think we'll actually see the full repertoire of him. Then we'll fully understand kind of where he stands in that division and where he stands in the sport.
Okay, Travis, you're going to have to run here in a minute, but let me ask you about this guy, Adam Kownacki. Scored a second-round knockout, TKO of Gerald Washington on the Thurman card. He's now 19-0, 15 knockouts. He's also beaten Artur Spilka and Charles Martin. Does this guy look like he might have everything he might need to become a force at heavyweight other than maybe a brassiere and a girdle and a suntan?
First, there was an interesting stat I wanted to say about Munguia. He was a whopping 90-1 favorite by Vegas odds, which is crazy to me. I've never heard of that in my life, but that was a curious one that I wanted to throw out there. But also, Kownacki, this guy, first of all, Dennis, he doesn't look the part. If you see this guy, he's flabby, his arms aren't even defined, but somehow, you know who he kind of reminds me of? It's a little bit of Chris Arreola. It's almost like he doesn't look fit. His punches, to me, honestly, don't even look hard, but they are because the way he dispatched Gerald Washington, because I thought that was a perfect match. I thought Gerald Washington was tough, and I was like, I kind of want to see what this Polish kid is all about. And he went out there. He actually rocked Washington, probably within the first 30 seconds. And I was just like, where did this guy come from? But here's what I'll say is this. I think this guy is going to be just like, to be honest, a Chris Arreola, because this day and age, we're not in a heavyweight division. We're in a super-sized heavyweight division. And these guys no longer are coming into the ring flabby, out of shape, almost like a George Foreman-like. These guys are coming in the ring looking like Anthony Joshua, looking like Deontay Wilder, looking like the Klitschko's. And what I mean by that is these guys are fit, they're ready, they're in shape, they don't have the flab around the stomachs, their arms are very defined, and I don't think that Kownacki can get away with being that out of shape, looking and get by and being these elite guys. I do think he's going to pose a threat to a lot of people because he can punch, and it does seem like he throws a lot of punches, but I don't see him. I see if he fights with Deontay Wilder, I see Deontay Wilder knocking him out or beating him up and punishing him pretty badly. I don't see him even coming close to beating a Joshua. I don't see him beating a Fury. So in that respect, I don't see him up there. But he 100% pleasantly surprised me last night. And I've seen a couple of his clips of his fights before this because he's had a couple decent wins. But last night he really impressed me. So you know what? It's always those guys that kind of come out of nowhere that actually end up doing something. But like I said, I think the longevity of his career, it reminds me of a Chris Arreola. Meaning he's not fit. He obviously can go 12 rounds, but to me, that extra flab, that extra everything, the non-defined arms, I think that comes into play in this day and age because these guys are just super-sized athletes now, and I don't see a guy like that keeping up with the Deontay Wilders, the Anthony Joshuas, even the Klitschko's. I could see a Klitschko coming back, and that'd be his first fight back. I can see him knocking out a guy like Kownacki.
This is the Ringside Boxing Show from Monterey, California. I'm Dennis Taylor. We're talking to our expert analysts, Travis Hartman, Rizwan Zahid, John J. Responti. Travis is going to have to leave here in a minute. John, Gary Russell Jr. wants a July fight with Leo Santa Cruz. Break this one down for us. Who do you like in that one and why, if they're able to pull this fight together?
Oh boy, this is a toss-up, Dennis. This is a 50-50 fight. We love those 50-50 fights, and we got it. Gary Russell Jr., all those Gary Russells, and we saw one last night fighting. He's 8-0 with 8 knockouts. They're all talented. They fight. The only thing that bothered us about Gary Russell Jr., and we've all said this, is he doesn't fight enough, and we can't figure out why he doesn't fight that often. We heard something about his hands. But we don't know that for a fact. And then Leo Santa Cruz, he always reminds me of, he's like a throwback guy to me. I always think that he would have been perfect in the 1970s fighting at the Olympic, because he's exciting, he's a humble kid, he wants to fight everybody pretty much now. He had a period where he really wasn't fighting a lot of guys, but then he fought Frampton twice, and he wants to fight the top guys, and I'm sure he'll fight Gary Russell. I would be very surprised if that doesn't happen. You got the super quick Russell, and you've got the super consistent Leo Santa Cruz. So that's why I say it's a 50-50 fight. I'm going to have to think on this one to even come up with a pick. I don't even know if I could give any. I don't even think I could give anybody an edge yet at this point. I think because I can see it going either way, obviously, and. Maybe, perhaps, Russell can do what Carl Frampton did in the first fight, which is outbox Leo Santa Cruz. But Russell also lost to Lomachenko, and I was there. I saw that fight, and that was mostly because Lomachenko just was so consistent. And as we know, that's what Santa Cruz's game is. He throws so many punches that Russell's going to be on the defensive and winging punches back. So. If I'm hold a gun to my head, I don't know. I'm not. I can't even hold a gun to my head. I can't give you a favorite right now, but I can tell you this: it should be a hell of a fight. I'm excited already thinking about it. You got two styles, different styles. So yeah, if this happens, I don't think it's official yet, but if it does, boy, it should be a good one.
Riz, you see an edge for one of these two guys?
You got to go with Russell. I don't know. He seems like he likes having the 10 playoffs or whatever it is. This is probably the shortest turnaround he's had in maybe 3 or 4 years. I just think of Leo Santa Cruz, a guy who just comes forward, is for a guy who works angles and all that. It could be a little tailor-made. But I'll say this: against a guy like Leo Santa Cruz, long way offs and all those things, he's going to make you work. He's going to make you work in round 11. Russell's not a guy who likes to throw a lot of punches, so he's going to be on his bicycle a lot in the later rounds. And if Santa Cruz is able to land some of those body shots and then invest early, I think there's a chance he could win on the scorecards, or maybe even score a knockdown, or maybe a late stoppage. But it's going to be rough for him early, because we know what Gary Russell brings. But and it's sad. We said this a bunch of times. Gary Russell could go down as maybe one of the greatest fighters and most untapped potential kind of fighters, where he could have been the most popular, best fighter in his generation, and he might be the best kept secret in boxing, and for no one's fault except his own. So it seems like he's actually taking it seriously, or at least if he's fighting, he wants the big fights now, which I guess is better than sometimes guys fighting twice a year and fighting fights that no one wants to see. So I'm going to give Gary Russell Jr. the edge, just because his talent's off the charts. I mean, no one's ever disagreed with that, and the only guy he's had trouble with is Lomachenko, and we all know how we feel about Lomachenko. So I think Russell, if he was fighting more often, I think he'd be number 2 pound-for-pound guy in the world, or maybe number 3. But it's a shame, because people just want to see him more and more, and hopefully we'll be able to see that a little more this year.
Russell's speed is otherworldly to me, and I think that's why I would give him the edge in that. Okay, so Eddie Hearn says Anthony Joshua's list of possible opponents is down to a short list now. Dillian White or Jarrell Big Baby Miller. He's already 1-0 against Dillian White. John, do you want to see that rematch, or would you rather see Joshua take on Big Baby, who might be outweighing Joshua unbelievably by 70 pounds when they get in the ring?
Amazing. I I would rather see him fight the big baby, to be honest, just because we've seen the White fight, and I don't think it's going to be any different. I think the outcome will be the same. I think Joshua will knock White out. White probably a little better than he was the first time they fought, but it's just like watching a show that you and then you saw it a year ago, and you're going, well, if I have a chance to watch something new instead of watching what I think is probably going to be a repeat, I'll go with something new, and that's what I'm thinking here. I think that White and Joshua would be more of a repeat of the first fight, maybe not in round 6 like it was the first fight. I believe it might be a little later, but it's just fascinating to me to see that big man, big baby, that over 300 pounder who can box a little, and see him trying to deal with the massive Joshua. They're so extreme in the sense that Joshua is so cut and big baby's just big, and he's quick for such a huge guy. So to me, that fight is compelling. Obviously, I think Joshua wins both fights, but I just because the whole newness of it, I think it would be an interesting one to watch, Big Baby and Anthony Joshua.
Okay, Pacquiao and Broner got 400,000 pay-per-view buys, which is a pretty damn good number. Riz, did that surprise you? And is Broner still part of that attraction, or was that just almost exclusively Pacquiao?
No, I think that's all Pacquiao. I don't think anyone has any interest in seeing Broner. I think people want to see Broner beat up by Pacquiao. Pacquiao still is a huge name, and we can't, discredit that. It'll be interesting to see what the numbers were for Thurman last night, because I'm sure they're going to be analyzing that if they're looking at making a Thurman and Pacquiao fight. I would imagine a Thurman-Pacquiao fight would maybe be similar numbers, maybe slightly less, because a lot of people want to see Broner lose, and I think we've seen that enough, though. So I don't think we need to see any of that embarrassment again. I think that's all Pacquiao, to be honest, and I think analyzing Thurman's always done pretty good numbers on Fox and PBC, so I think you're going to be analyzing that, and I definitely think that's the next pay-per-view fight.
Okay, and John, one more thing about Broner. What kind of future does this guy have when he can't box anymore? Last week he blew off a court appearance in Florida so he could go to a Lakers game in L.A. instead. So now there's a warrant out for his arrest in Florida again. Man, it's been just an unbelievable several months for Broner, several years for Broner. But when the lights go out for a guy like this, man, what can we expect? He's going to end up in jail or something, isn't he?
Either in jail or dead, Dennis. You think that it's supposedly at some point in most people's lives when they reach a certain age, they grow up. But, age, it's just a number. It doesn't mean somebody will. And he's going to be 30 soon, but he hasn't grown up. He's just the same old Adrian Broner. He could say he has, but he hasn't. He was more of a con man fighter now than anything else. And that's disappointing because he might, maybe when he finally figures it out when he's about 80, if he's still around, which I seriously doubt, he'll go, boy, I wasted whatever talent I had. I had some, but I certainly didn't use it the way I should have. He's just very irresponsible and doesn't seem to really care about things. I mean, that's the point. He goes to a Laker game instead of trying to take care of some of these things. He lives in this chaotic world. His world is very chaotic and crazy, and he doesn't seem to mind it. And he doesn't seem to learn. So when he doesn't have that money anymore, he's going to see that a lot of his friends were only hanging around with him because he had all that money. Maybe that's what he needs. Yeah. Maybe he's one of these people that needs to just fall all the way down into the gutter before he goes, oh, my, I got to do something. But I kind of doubt it. I hate to say it. I hope this doesn't happen. I hope in all my heart that I'm wrong. But I think if he falls in the gutter, he'll stay there. And he reminds me a little of the way Tyson was, where he was going for a while. And we thought Tyson used to say he didn't think he would live to be 40 years old or even 35, and he turned it around. So I guess it's possible that Broner could figure it out, but I just don't see it because he just keeps getting into trouble all the time, and then he doesn't show any improvement by accepting responsibility, or he only goes to makes court appearances when he's forced to, or when he's arrested, or when he's fined more money. So he doesn't seem to take anything seriously, and that he's got that entitlement thing in his head, and that maybe he's going to have to lose all that before he takes it seriously. But his future is very bleak, and he made millions against Pacquiao, and he'll probably be through it all in another few months.
You know, and what's going to jolt him, I think, is when he doesn't get elected to the Hall of Fame. He you know, a few weeks ago he was saying, I've had a Hall of Fame career. I don't know where he gets that, except that he's one of those narcissists, you know, he just
yes.
He's unconscious. So and I don't really have a question about this, but we wanted to mention that Adonis Stevenson took his first steps since he was injured against Eleider Alvarez. That's just terrific news, of course, and I don't think any of us ever want to see him in the ring again for his own good, but hopefully he can recover from this and lead a normal life. So you guys always hear the truth from Travis Hartman, Rizwan Zahid, and John J. Responti on the Ringside Boxing Show. They're our expert analysts. John's going to be back in a few minutes to help me interview Colleen Aycock about her great new biography about Max Baer. Travis took off a little bit ago, and Riz, thank you very much, and you have a great week, man, up there in freezing cold Toronto.
Take care.
All right. We also want to give a shout-out to another one of our local fighters, Joel Diaz Jr., who's part of that Garcia boxing stable. He's going to be in action February 10th at Save Mart Arena in Fresno, where he's going to put a 24-1 record with 20 knockouts on the line against Christian Rafael Correa, who comes from Argentina, with a record of 28-7-2 and 12 knockouts. This is going to be Joel Diaz's second fight since October of 2017, when he suffered the only loss of his career against the Rougarou, Regis Prograis. And we wish Joel good luck in Fresno, and I'm going to try and get him on next week probably to talk to us about that. We're going to take a quick break to tell you about our book, and then we'll return with our man in England, Paul McLaughlin. Hang with us, and we will be back in about 1 minute.
If you like the Ringside Boxing Show, you're going to love the website, ringsideboxingshow.com.
What are you doing? I'm Dennis Taylor, co-author of the Amazon bestseller Intimate Warfare, the true story of the Arturo Gatti and Mickey Ward boxing trilogy. You know, writing this book was a labor of love for John J. Responti and myself. We enjoyed every minute of the process and considered it a privilege to tell the tale of one of the most electrifying boxing trilogies in the history of this sport. Intimate Warfare traces the collision course of Arturo Gatti and Mickey Ward from their earliest days through their 3 epic fights, as well as the aftermath of this great rivalry, which culminated in one of the greatest friendships in boxing. Intimate Warfare has received a 4.5-star rating from readers and was endorsed by Hall of Famers Harold Letterman and Joe Cortez and 2-time Trainer of the Year Virgil Hunter. Our foreword was written by Ray Boom Boom Mancini, another one of the greatest blood and guts fighters of our time. Get your copy today at Amazon.com.
Hi there, it's Paul McLaughlin with your weekly roundup of everything going on in the UK boxing scene at the moment. Well, first, Dave Allen and Lucas Brown have agreed terms for a heavyweight battle in April, confirmed Eddie Hearn. White Rhino ended last year with a stoppage win over Ariel Barracamonte and will next face the Australian, a former WBA regular champion, with a venue to be announced for the bout. Now, Brown has racked up 2 knockout victories since suffering his first professional loss, which was, if you remember, an explosive knockout by Dillian White at the O2 last March. 26-year-old Allen also defeated domestic rival Nick Webb in dramatic style during an eventful 2018 and welcomed the opportunity to test himself against Big Daddy Brown. Now, we asked Dave Allen if this fight should be the main event.
I think on a normal Sky show, I think it could be, because boxing, people always say to me, Dave, you're not the greatest fighter in the world, but in terms of boxing, it's not always about being the greatest fighter in the world, it's about getting guns on seats, and we're very fortunate that got a very good, I still don't like saying fan base, I still don't like saying it, but a good set of support, a strong support that like come and watch, like that's a bad tickets, come and watch at home and possibly in Brown. Yeah, I think it could be. You know, he's a former world heavyweight champion, and I'm just me, but obviously my last few wins have got me up there. I think 35 in the world with box rate, whatever that means. Not sure. If they're nice to me, I think it's important. If not, I don't. But yeah, I think me and Brown's a good fight. I think it's a good undercard fight on a big show. And I think on a Saturday fight night, I think it could be a main event. Yeah.
Well, I can't wait for that bout. He's a great character as Dave Allen, and he really does do the sport a lot of credit. So good luck to him in that one. Next up, another British hero, Anthony Crolla, will soon learn a likely date for a world title fight with Vasyl Lomachenko, and intends to assess his future after facing the Ukrainian star. The Mancunian defeated Daud Yordan on points in November to become Lomachenko's WBA mandatory challenger, but the unified champion could firstly attempt to add the IBF belt to his WBA and WBO lightweight titles. Richard Comey and Isa Chaniev will fight for the vacant IBF belt on February the 2nd, with Lomachenko lining up the winner, and Crolla's promoter Eddie Hearn is waiting to see when the WBA defence will be scheduled for a lucrative bout in America. So, how does Crolla feel about a potential fight with the pound-for-pound king?
Yeah, it'd be great to get in the ring with him, but I won't be going in there with that attitude. It'd be great to share a ring with, a future Hall of Famer. That's not how I'll be going in the ring, and I look forward to it, and I'll be looking at working on a game plan to be better than I've ever been in my career, and that's all I need. And I look forward to the task. You challenge the best, and that's what I'll be doing.
Well, that should be another one. He's got a great heart as Crolla. Only time will tell if that actually happens. Now, Anthony Joshua will be making big decisions this weekend as negotiations continue with a 3-man shortlist of opponents for the next World Heavyweight title fight. Britain's unified champion is expected to finalise his next bout after a meeting on Friday with promoter Eddie Hearn, who has made offers to Dillian Whyte and Tyson Fury, while American Jarrell Miller is yet to discuss terms. A rematch with Whyte or a blockbuster battle with Fury would be staged at Wembley, which is booked for April the 13th. Or Joshua could instead make a US debut against New Yorker Miller at Madison Square Garden in May or June. Here's what Hearn had to say.
We have to make a decision. We've got April 13 on lockdown. AJ's training now for April 13, just to make sure that, if that does come about, he's ready. And that's our preference. That's what we want to do. Obviously, we need an opponent. I feel like we've made a number of good offers to several of the world-ranked fighters and other champions. Some of those don't think that we've made particularly good offers, and it depends really also what value they put on either winning a world title or winning or unifying 4 of the belts or 5 of the belts in the division. So it's a little bit frustrating, but everything's in play right now. Wilder, Fury, Whyte, Miller, they're the 4 that it could be really. Either one of those can step up and take the fight like that. So we've made a series of great offers. I've made many of them public. We kind of live in a world now. It's quite unique in boxing where we're trying to interact with the fans and give them as much insight. They actually know the offers. Previously, that didn't happen for fans. So you can make your own mind up whether you think it's right or wrong. We think we've made some great offers, but yeah, we need to pull the trigger this week.
Well, I think that'll be finalised very, very shortly. And, guys, April the 13th is another piece of boxing significance. I will be announcing over the next week or so something quite big in British boxing for that date. All will be revealed. In the meantime, it's great to be back. Gloves up and protect yourselves at all times. Back to the studio, guys.
Well, that was a cryptic little dangle there on the part of Paul McLaughlin. We'll look forward to that announcement. Paul, thank you very much. Very much appreciated as always. We're going to take another minute right here to tell you about our loyal sponsor, Garcia Boxing. They've kept us on the air for a decade now, and we are very appreciative of them. And then we'll be back with this week's featured guest right after that. So stick around. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Dennis Taylor, host of the Ringside Boxing Show, where since 2008 we have been continuously sponsored by Garcia Boxing, the first family of the sweet science on California's beautiful Central Coast. Trainers Max and Sam Garcia and ring strategist Dean Hamilton are regarded among the most knowledgeable in the game. And Kathy Garcia, who manages all Garcia boxing fighters, is renowned for her integrity and career guidance, having taken 2 boxers to #1 world rankings. Together they comprise one of the most respected teams in the sport. Learn more by calling 831-261-3214 or send them an email at garciaboxing25@aol.com.
This is tremendous, Don, just tremendous. The atmosphere heavy, uncertain, overtones of ugliness. A reminder in a way of how it was in March of 1964 at Miami Beach, when Clay met Liston for the first time and nobody was certain how it would turn out. The crowd is tense. They've been here since 10 this morning.
When a fighter goes in training, life is awful rough. He gets an awful tough routine. For example, here's a sample of the work he does. And all the work he does is mean.
Lucky fella was a brave, fortune in my glove. Lucky fella on the make for love. In that corner, old Kid Crumble, watch me knock out a double knockout. Lucky fella, riding high, just a lucky guy.
Welcome back to the Ringside Boxing Show on the Grueling True Sports Network. I'm Dennis Taylor with John J. Responti, and that guy you just heard singing is the former heavyweight champion of the world, Max Baer. He reigned in the mid-1930s. Today's featured guest is the author of a wonderful new biography on this fighter, who was one of the biggest stars in boxing back in about 1934 and 1935 when he reigned as heavyweight champ. Max Baer, Madcap Maxie, as he was nicknamed in the press, also was a guy with a huge personality, as you just heard. He had a Hollywood career. He had a major role in The Prize Fighter and the Lady, which is what that is a clip from. And that starred Walter Houston and Myrna Loy. And you can also see him with Humphrey Bogart in The Harder They Fall, and with Abbott and Costello in Africa Screams. And if you really want to dig deep, go find Rowan and Martin in Once Upon a Horse. He's in that too. He was unfairly depicted as a real cad in Cinderella Man, and that starred Russell Crowe and was a big hit movie, and we'll get into some of that. All of that brings us to our introduction of his biographer, Colleen Aycock, who teamed up with her husband David W. Wallace to write The Magnificent Max Baer, The Life of the Heavyweight Champion and Film Star is the name of the book. Colleen, it's been a long time, about 9 years, in fact, since we last spoke to you on the Ringside Boxing Show. On that occasion, you and another co-author, Mark Scott, were talking to us about another excellent book you wrote, Joe Gans, a biography of the first African-American world boxing champion. And you and Mark also wrote Tex Rickard, Boxing's Greatest Promoter. How's life in Albuquerque, which, by the way, is the city of my birth? How are you?
Oh, my goodness. That's wonderful. Well, I'm here in Albuquerque, and it's wonderful. And thank you. And it's been too long since I've talked to you guys. Almost 10 years is too long.
Yeah, I only lived there for about 10 minutes, I think. Probably until I was about a year and a half, and we lived right down the street from the Unser boys. And I remember my mother telling me... Oh, my gosh. Yeah, they were... let's see, Bobby was 19 at the time, or no, it was the youngest brother. Al was 19 at the time. Bobby, I think, was 21, and then the oldest brother, I think his name's Eddie, maybe, was about 25. But she used to complain that they would race up and down our streets in their hot rod cars. So. Oh my gosh! Well, you didn't live off, and maybe you did off Tramway. So when I started coming up here, my cousin had this jalopy, we called it, and Tramway was a sand road, and with a lot of hills and bumps, and so we would always go racing along that road too. A lot of territory to race out here. Yeah. Wonderful family, the Answers. Okay, well, you know what? We always like to find out why an author picked a topic, and in your case, you were inspired, at least in part, by quite a personal connection to Max Baer. Your father sparred with him, and I had an uncle, actually, who sparred with Fritzy Zivik and his brothers in Pittsburgh, but unfortunately I never met my uncle and never got to talk to him about it. What stories do you remember about your dad telling you from that experience? Did he talk about it?
Yes, he did, all the time. And so that's why I knew when we started, we sort of wanted to do a history of boxing, starting with Joe Gans and the early glove boxers. So not to go back to that, but when I was in D.C. Writing for the U.S. Capitol biographies, I was able to do that research in Baltimore, his hometown. But I always wanted to write up to Max Baer because of the stories my father told me. And Max Baer died in 1959, and I was only 8 years old. So that was very poignant of a memory to me when he died, because my father was everybody loved Max Baer, and my father sparred with him right after he won the title from Carnera in 1934. Wow. And my father got the gloves that he wore. So, I mean, those gloves were sacred. We had those gloves hanging in the living room my entire life. Occasionally my dad would let me wear the gloves, then he would let me box with the gloves. And, you know, while everybody else was watching, Cinderella and the glass slippers, I thought those red gloves were the prettiest things I'd ever seen in my life. Those were just so emblematic of my dad's experience with Max. Everybody loved Max. So Max was revered in our family. My older brothers, they boxed a bit, but Max was revered in our family. And my dad, as a Depression-era fighter and trying to make money, boxing was so important in the Depression. There were more boxers during the Depression because they were out of work. Everyone was out of work, and boxing was a way to make a few cents, literally, in the prize rings. And more prize rings were coming, and, formal venues for boxing began in the 30s. So Dad got Max Baer sent an ad for sparring partners. He was expecting to go out after his win for his title defenses, and his manager wanted a fast fighter. They were always looking for middleweights, welters, middles, to train the boxers. They had the heavyweights, but they wanted the middleweights for speed. And Dad got on a train from South Texas, the Valley, and answered the call and went out to San Francisco and sparred with Max. And unfortunately, because of circumstances out of New York and control of boxing then, he didn't make the title defense that he was supposed to, that Dad was out there working with him. It was supposed to be for Levinsky, but he did fight Levinsky eventually. So, yeah, we have so many stories. Max would give you the shirt off his back, and the sample of those gloves is an indication of that.
Yeah. Wow. He's from his career preceded all of us, all three of us, but my impression is that Max Baer was kind of a big, playful, overgrown kid. He was a guy who loved becoming famous and being famous. He liked people and parties and hanging out with celebrities, and probably more than he even liked boxing. That's the image that's been painted of Max Baer over the years. Is it an accurate one?
Yes, it is. That's very accurate. He was a big kid, a big child. He loved, and in fact, my dad talked about that frequently. But very, very smart. I don't want to downplay that. His brains were just phenomenal. All the sports writers thought that he was one of the smartest fighters as well. But he was quick. He could, he could ad lib. He was so quick mentally, and that's that image of the playful child. He's thinking faster than everyone else. So he can come up with quips and ad libs, and in comedy, people love to laugh, and they surely needed a lot to laugh at. But he was the prankster. He was always my dad picked up so many of those pranks, and my dad also loved to be a prankster, and so he got that. I'm sure he got that from Max Baer, because my father wasn't that outgoing, and so I'm sure all of that affected him. And it was a boy's world. It was a man's world. And Max did bring that smile to boxing, and everyone acknowledged that in the 30s, that he did bring that lighthearted humor to boxing. He could be serious in the ring, but he also loved to play in the ring. He loved his audience loved them, and he was so sympathetic. In fact, in his title match, Harry Smith out of the San Francisco Chronicle slumped over. He was at ringside and was a friend of Max and slumped over in his chair, and they thought he'd had a heart attack. And Baer was more concerned with Harry and came over to the side of the ring and was always asking about Harry. How's he doing? How's he doing? So Max could think in three directions at any one time.
You know, a lot of that is completely contrary to what we all saw in the film Cinderella Man, where he was portrayed as an obnoxious, mean-spirited bully who got his comeuppance from James Braddock in one of the biggest upsets in boxing history. As good as that movie is in many ways, does that part make you wince?
Yes. And it would have made my father never got to see it. He died before that movie, but it would have just devastated my father. And when I first saw it in the theater, I was just shocked by it. But then, so that's another thing that a writer has to, sort of ferret out. Why did that happen? What did Max think about, would have thought about that situation? Ron Howard took that portrayal of Max from The Harder They Fall.
Right.
But Max, and that was in ~56 with Humphrey Bogart. That was the last film that Humphrey Bogart made. And that was supposed to be a documentary originally planned for the life of Max Baer. But it ended up being that with Humphrey Bogart. So The Harder They Fall, in there you have an image, that same image of Max being the killer, being the one who, is not kind to women, just an awful portrayal even in The Harder They Fall. And so it really makes me think, why would Max portray that image in The Harder They Fall? Well, he'd been in the movies for 20 years. So he was a wonderful actor. He could play any part. But here's my take on that. I believe that Max was still consumed with the image of being yellow or the quitter in the Joe Louis fight. So I believe he was still, in that day and age, still trying to overcome that image.
Interesting.
So I think all of that, you have to look, that's why I love history. You have to look at everything that came before it. There's always a cause and effect and a consequence. But I do think Ron Howard took the image of Max out of The Harder They Fall. And so, yes, and that image is nothing, in Cinderella Man, was nothing like what Baer was. And Baer's son, Max Jr., hated that image as well. And everybody that knew Max, and every boxing aficionado that knew about Max knew that was not his character at all.
That's really interesting, Colleen, because I remember when I saw Cinderella Man, and I was doing like you, my eyes were blinking as I was watching this, and I thought, because I love movies, and I love film noir, and I love boxing movies, I thought, wait a minute, they just reached in there and grabbed the character he played from Harder They Fall, and put him in Cinderella Man, and I mean it was really, really painful, and I could imagine someone like you that had a personal connection, that must have been just totally devastating.
It was devastating. I just feel so sorry for Max Jr. having to see that movie. And you know what? The movie is other than that, the movie is a wonderful boxing film. It's just wonderful. Yep. But I'm afraid that people that see the movie and don't know anything about Max will get the wrong impression. But that was not like he was never like that at all.
Yeah. Reading your book, and I was thinking about all the research you did, I guess it wasn't that big of a surprise that Max became a boxer, right? And this was really cool that you uncovered this. His father was a fighter as well, and I didn't know that. That's correct, right?
No one knew that. I didn't know that. I never knew that. It wasn't until I came across the records out of Denver that I found those, and it was in one document. Pat Kennedy's obituary said that he had fought Jacob Baer, Max Baer's father, the one-time champion of the West. Well, I was trying to research, where did the name Butcher Boy come from? They were all butchers, 3 generations of butchers, and Max was a great butcher himself. But his father was a great butcher, but he was also a great boxer. And in fact, his father had gone 22 rounds with Jim Jeffries. They were approximately the same age. There was a year's difference between them. And so he actually either fought or sparred. I don't know what the 20. I'm pretty sure that the 22 rounds is accurate. But he was great friends. Jacob Baer, the father, was great friends with Tom Sharkey, and they even were in the ring together. And there were many references that Jacob Baer had trained, and literally the training came from, he was the person that was at this facility that south of Denver, Elyria, that had all the boxing matches when boxing was illegal in Denver. And this was in the late 1890s. So 3 Mile House, literally where Jacob and his father came down to the slaughter area on the railroad. The slaughter areas were always 3 miles away from the city. And so the 3 Mile House was that marker, and it was a bar, and it was probably where Jacob's father, Ashel, also had his meat market. They were all big men. They were all over 6 foot, and they were all magistrates or sheriffs. So his grandfather was the sheriff of Elyria. Jacob was the sheriff and the boxer in Elyria, again 3 miles south of Denver. And then when Denver annexed Elyria in 1904, the brother Ben, Jacob's brother Ben, became a policeman or sheriff in Denver. And so that background of big men, obviously in those sheriff positions, obviously respected, well, very talented. And if you're a butcher, you're very, very strong, and your hands are very, very fast. And so it didn't surprise me to find out that Jacob Baer was a champion boxer as well. So obviously that was in their blood, that was in their genes, and that was in their culture.
And the family member we're leaving out right now is Buddy, Max's brother, who was a world-class elite fighter.
Absolutely. If you look at Buddy's record and his 46 wins, and he was phenomenal as well. And Buddy was 18 when Max won the championship. And so that was also, do you think he didn't learn anything by following his big brother around? And Buddy went on all the road trips with Max when all the time they were touring, and then got fights from some of the same fighters that Max would fight on the road. Buddy would get those. So Buddy was trained and by the same manager, Ansel Hoffman. So he had a great upbringing. But the funny thing is that Ansel could never let those two in the ring together. Oh my gosh. Max Baer, and people have asked me this all the time about my father, could Max Baer pull his punches? Because, remember, he was a heavy puncher. He wasn't a boxer. He was, a brawler, not a brawler in the Tony Galento sense, but a puncher like Dempsey. And he had, everyone says during that period, the hardest punch. Now, Joe Louis could hit hard, but his punches came faster. Even Joe Louis said Max Baer had the hardest punch of the era. So these were, but he could not pull his punches with his brother. And it's that sibling rivalry. Ansel Hoffman said they were jealous. Max was jealous of Buddy, and they would get in a fight. And even for a television crew, the television crew wanted them to get in the ring together. It's like wanting the Klitschko brothers to be in the ring together, or any of the brothers. But I'm telling you, Buddy was supposed to be in a preliminary fight when Max did a benefit for the Campbell family. Guess what? Buddy was in a body cast from having been hit by Max Baer.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They couldn't take that out of the ring.
Yeah.
Now, they did a lot of exhibitions in the Army together, but those were different kinds of things. When they really got in the ring and practice, it was not fun, pretty.
Yeah, yeah. researching your book and everything, and this was an impression I got, but was boxing Max Baer's passion, or did he do it because he could make a lot of money and he was good at it?
That you just named it. That was it.
Yeah.
It wasn't his passion. It was a business for him. And when he was in New York and he saw James Corbett in a play, he was absolutely fascinated with that. And Ansel Hoffman used that as bait for him. When he had lost so many matches, and his history was a roller coaster ride of massive big wins and big losses. And when he would get down, Ansel baited him with that. Well, you can't be in the movies unless you're a champion. Actually, Dorothy Dunbar baited him with the same thing. So I think that he was a showman. He was the ultimate showman, and that's why everybody loved him. He could put on a show in the ring in addition to boxing, and that's what he did, and that's what was so frustrating for promoters, trainers, but it drew the crowds. They never knew what Max was going to do in the ring or out. And he was also, when you try to describe his boxing style, he was a heavy puncher, and he told everybody, even Grantland Rice and Jack Dempsey, who managed him for a while and promoted him, I can't go in the ring and just unleash, this right chopping block every minute. I have to do something else, and so that was part of his fight in flourishes. And so people were very frustrated. Come on, Max. Let's gear it up. Let's fight. Let's gear this up. So he did fight in flourishes.
Yeah. Okay, tell us about the story of Frankie Campbell, who fought Baer in 1930. What happened after that bout?
After the bout or with the bout?
During
Frankie,
the bout and after, yeah.
Okay. Max needed that fight desperately. Frankie Campbell, and I love that Scottish boxing name. His name was Francisco Camilli.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
so they changed it to Frankie Campbell. But Frankie was 26, and he held the title of the Pacific Coast Boxing Champion. So that was that really big California title. And in 1926, he left boxing. He thought, because he was being managed by a mob then, gangsters then, who siphoned off all of his money. So he needed money, and he left to go into baseball. And he stayed out of boxing for 2 years, came back in 1928 because he needed the money that boxing could bring. And so that's, but he was a longtime champion out of heavyweight, out of San Francisco. And now here comes this Oakland guy, this younger guy, and Frankie, before that bout, had 13 KOs, Baer had 19. So this was huge. This fight was huge because the winner of that fight was predicted to become the next heavyweight champion of the world. These were big heavyweights like Dempsey. And so this was a big fight. Baer went into that fight, and it was hard to come by. The promoters were fighting over that fight, and that's actually how Ansel Hoffman, Baer's longtime manager, came into the picture. Ansel Hoffman could get the fight, and so that's where Ansel Hoffman comes in, thank heavens, because then Ansel takes over the finances for both fighters, Campbell and Baer, from that fight. The fight. In round one, Baer knocks him down, and Frankie wisely took a 9 count on that. Frankie was a good fighter. I mean, there was nothing, there was no advantage literally for Baer, although he wasn't as tall. He was 4 inches shorter, and he came in underweight. No one really knows why he came in so light at that fight, 179, if he was sick or whatever. But regardless, Baer was at 195. That's a big weight and height advantage, but he was certainly a veteran of the ring. In the second round, Baer was knocked to the canvas by Campbell. we don't know if he was knocked or if he slipped. The canvas was wet, and Baer was down on the ground, and the referee sent Campbell back to his corner. So as Campbell was going back to his corner, Baer sprung up, and Campbell looked back, and Baer hit him in the jaw. That knocked him down, but he was saved by the bell. Then the fighting was very, very heated for the next 2 rounds, and then by the fatal 5th round, Baer had knocked him down, and he was down in a seated position on the ropes. And what we know from that was from the writer Robert Edgren, who was also the California Commissioner of Boxing. And the ring was up high, Edgren was down low, and he was near Campbell's corner where he was knocked down and held by the ropes in a seated position. And Edgren couldn't even look. Baer hit him so fast. It was estimated that Baer was hitting him with left and rights as many as 12 shots before the referee could get over there and call him off. So Edgren then slammed Baer, called him brainless, and said that, he'd virtually killed, and Campbell died a few days later, the next day actually. And so it was big news. They'd already lost a fighter in the ring before. The public was incensed. The San Francisco papers denounced boxing, and then all of the commissioners then were investigated. The fixed fights came up. Baer was in court. Ansel held all of Frankie Campbell's money from that fight and refused to give it to his manager, Cal Working, and the seconds, Greaseball Maloney. I mean, those names say it all. And so Ansel really protected Baer. At that point, Baer had been involved in some, quote, fixed fights with Tiny Abbott and De La Fuente, and was driving around in a $4,000 car, fancy car, when the average car costs $500, $600. So he was flashy. But what he supposedly got paid for was carrying Tiny Abbott for 5 rounds. But it was definitely the mob that arranged all that. So all of this came to play. The death of Frankie Campbell with Baer, the mob-related fights with Tony Abbott. In the meantime, Carnera was over there, and he was involved in a fixed fight with Chevalier, and that, of course, is documented in The Harder They Fall, where Chevrolet is killed in the movie, but he actually wasn't. But all those 6 fights came. So Ansel wanted Max to get out of all of the grand juries, the commissioner, the governors, inquisitions, all of those things. So Ansel paid Max $5,000 for part of his contract and paid him, Lorimer, Baer's manager, $10,000 to take over management of Baer. Sent Baer to Reno, where he would get out of the crosshairs of all the political stuff in California. And of course, you know what happened in Reno. That's the mob capital, the Hollywood capital, where all the starlets and everybody, including Dempsey, went to get divorces. So Max was in a different element and introduced to a different element, and his $5,000 was gone in a weekend.
This is the Ringside Boxing Show from Monterey, California. I'm Dennis Taylor with John J. Responte. We're talking to Colleen Aycock. She is the author of The Magnificent Max Baer, The Life of the Heavyweight Champion and Film Star. Colleen, what kind of emotional impact did the death of Campbell have on Max?
He never got over it. And he never was able to unleash his mighty right fist after that. He had nightmares about it the rest of his life. And that tells you something about Max's personality. He could reconcile it intellectually that was part of his job in the ring. And that's what he told the committees when it was investigated. They said, "Why did you keep hitting him?" And he said, "Well, that's what I was trained to do until the referee called him off. That's what I was trained to do. He had to be out." And Max and the fighters in those days knew they had to knock their opponents out because the decisions were so questionable in those days. Yep. And so Max was doing what he was trained to do, but he never got over it emotionally. He never wanted to kill anybody. He loved people, and he said that. And I think that that's what affected his loss with Ernie Schaff later. I think he couldn't put Ernie out. He could not put people out at the very end because and everybody, including his trainers, tried to say, Max, get mean. Jack Dempsey, I can't tell you how many times Jack Dempsey and Grantland Wise told him, you've got to get mean in there, Max. Get mean. But he couldn't. Not after the death of Campbell.
Did the Schaff, Ernie Schaff died also after a fight with Baer, and Baer was blamed for that. Did that happen before or after the Campbell fight?
That was after the Campbell fight. And Max had only been, that was his second year of fighting when he met Ernie Schaff. So Ansel takes Baer to New York. Now, okay, so good and bad for the death of Campbell. Max hated it that he killed a man in a ring. And it just devastated him in later life when children would say, oh, is that the man that killed a man in a ring? He could never get away from that. Yet at the same time, Ansel Hoffman realized he could use Max's killer reputation in New York. And people were ready for they wanted a killer. Just like Jack Dempsey, they wanted a Dempsey type to take over. And Max could fit this bill now that he had beaten Campbell and actually killed him. So he goes to New York, and again, his second year of fighting, and Max loses a 10-round decision to Ernie Schaff. Ernie Schaff was a significant boxer in his own right. He'd already beaten the likes of, young Stribling, coming up, Tommy Laughlin, Tuffy Griffiths, Jimmy Braddock, Uska Dunn. He'd already beaten those people. So it wasn't surprising that Max lost to him. But when Max had him down, Max just didn't have the killer instinct in that and lost that fight. Now, the second fight was in Chicago 2 years later. The first fight was in 1930. Max had just gone to New York. And the second fight was in Chicago in 32. And these were part of those elimination bouts. But Max, after losing so many fights in New York, he had to win that fight. And Max I think that second fight showed you what Max could also take. I mean, these blows that Schaff was giving him were just bouncing off of Max Baer. But in the 10th, Max hit him, and he was out for 5 minutes, and Max thought he had killed him, and Max was devastated again. Ernie Schaff came through that fight. 6 months later, he fights Carnera again in the 33 elimination bouts, and everyone says that the blow that Carnera landed on Schaff wasn't enough to hurt him, but he died 4 days later. No one said anything about Ernie and Carnera. They said it was the fight previous when Max knocked him out, and Max was the true cause of Ernie Schaff's death. So you'll find many references that Max killed 2 men in the ring, Schaff and Campbell, but that wasn't the case. Schaff died 6 months later after other fights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing that really surprised, there was actually a number of surprises in your book, which was really wonderful while I was reading it, Colleen. Max Baer was suspended. Yeah, Max Baer was suspended so many times by the California Commission. Explain why they kept suspending him.
They hated him. They hated him. And look what they did to him in New York as well. It wasn't just California. Edgren, Robert Edgren on the commission, thought that Max didn't need to kill Campbell. But because Edgren was so everyone was affected by that death, and they got such bad publicity in the press for that. And let me tell you, they didn't like Max's lifestyle. He was a quote playboy type. Even one of the commissioners who was a minister on the side, said, well, I'll probably accept Max back for a license if he comes to church with me. So that Sunday, the commissioner gave a lecture on the prodigal son. I think it went over everybody's heads. And so Max was always eliminated by, he couldn't get a license. Even Ansel Hoffman tried to get a license. But, you see, Carnero, they had such a bad reputation because Carnero had fought the fixed fights there in California as well. So California was trying to clean up its act, but Baer was caught in the crosshairs of that. And then when he got to New York, Jimmy Johnston, the promoter at Madison Square Garden, tried to get Baer to switch management. He tried to buy him off. He even promised him the title, and that was before the Carnero fight. And Max wouldn't jump ship, and Ansel Hoffman was livid. So Jimmy Johnston then at the Garden started hating Max, and then he couldn't get fights there. And, wherever Max went, he was loved by the fans, but hated by the management who couldn't control him.
Yeah. At the beginning of the show, we played a clip from The Prize Fighter and the Lady, and when we introduced you, and Baer starred in that 1933 movie with Myrna Loy and heavyweight champion Primo Carnera. The film includes a staged fight with Carnero, right?
It does. That was the advertising for the Carnera fight. So that film was 6 months before the fight. And when they came to Max to do, actually, the history of that movie was Clark Gable was supposed to be the sailor in The Lady, and Clark Gable was tied up in a contract, and so they changed it to The Prize Fighter and The Lady because Max Baer had been doing radio shows for Gillette, and he could sing, and he was melodic, and he was handsome, and he was quick-witted and keen on his feet and extremely articulate. Everything about Max Baer fit the movie scene, so they nabbed him for that starring role, and then it was Max's idea. He was such a genius at proposing shows, which he proposed so many television shows later in the 50s. But for that show, he said, well, why not get Primo Carnero to star in the opposing role? It was just supposed to be about a prize fighter in a championship bout, and the lady falls for the prize fighter. And so it was at his suggestion that Primo was brought over. Actually, Baer said that it was from running those scenes in that movie, and Jack Dempsey was the referee, by the way. So he set up a stage. They didn't want, it was critical of Madison Square Garden, it was critical of the New York, it was critical of everybody, so they didn't want, they had to set up a new stage, and so they had Madison Square Ranch out there, and it looks like a real fight, and I think, I enjoyed that movie, The Prize Fighter and the Lady, probably more so than even The Harder They Fall, but nevertheless, Max got a good look at Primo Carnero, how big he was. He was a mastodon. He was 6'6", weighed 165 pounds. If you've ever been in the museum in Canastota, you'll see his fist casts are twice as large as anyone else's. And there's a couple of pictures in the book that show you can see his hands and how big they were. And so that prepared Max for that fight. And how did it prepare him? Well, everybody says, well, Carnero wasn't a great boxer, but he could pull you. He had a great fist. He could certainly pull you down, and he had a great chin. And so, while in the actual title fight with Carnero and Baer, everyone talks about the 11 knockdowns. There weren't 11 knockdowns. There were 11 times Carnero went to the floor, but only 6 from knockdowns. The rest were either slips or wrestling that they went down. But that gave Baer a good look and feel for Carnero.
We're talking to Colleen Aycock on the Ringside Boxing Show. Colleen is the author of The Magnificent Max Baer, The Life of the Heavyweight Champion and Film Star. You can find it on Amazon, and just Google it. You'll find it. And her dad sparred with Max Baer. Her dad was a fighter. Colleen, like most fighters, you alluded to this a few minutes ago, like most fighters at the time, Max Baer had dealings with the mob. How deep was that, and how did he handle it?
Max's dealings were with a bad original manager, his first manager. Everybody thought that Ansel Hoffman was with him the entire time, but the first manager was Ham Lorimer out of, they called him the Millionaire Kid because his father owned a foundry where Max worked for $3 a day when he first came to Oakland in the shipyard foundries. So Max got tied up with that Abbott affair early on in his boxing career, which destroyed his reputation with the commissioners and the authorities in California. And after Ansel Hoffman took over, Max had dealings with the mob only through Ansel Hoffman. Ansel was left to deal with the mob. And Jack Dempsey also had to deal with the mob. So let me go back to give some kind of brief historical context for this. In 1929, Tex Rickard died. Sadly, it was at the time of the market crash and the Depression, and that's what destabilized boxing for the 1930s and allowed the mob to come in and get its grips. And so Tex Rickard really controlled the boxing scene in Madison Square Garden in New York and with the mob, and he told Dempsey was his last partner, and they were going to build some more Madison Square Gardens. I don't want to get off on Tex Rickard, but I want to set the stage for how the mob was able to come in. Tex Rickard always told Jack Dempsey that you have to deal with the mob because they are the money backers, but you don't have to get in bed with them. And so Dempsey learned that. Dempsey, when he was trying to promote the fights in Reno, which he did for Uskedun and Max Baer, he was dealing with the Chicago mob there in Reno. And so Dempsey also knew that he had to deal with the mob because they were the money. They had seats in every major sports stadium. And it was the money came from the mob. When you go back to New York, Oni Madden, Billy Duffy, those were all mob figures, and they were supporting fighters and had money in the prize ring. So Max was boxing in movies and having fun, so he never really had any direct dealings that way after he got with Ansel Hoffman. Ansel Hoffman had to deal with not only the mob, but how about Adolf Hitler? For me, that was the most incredible find for that book when Ansel Hoffman went directly to Adolf Hitler. And Jack Dempsey was able to corner that Schmeling fight with Ansel Hoffman.
Yeah, incredible.
Sorry, I jumped around there.
That's all right. Now, this next question is a big one because this raised my eyebrows a little bit when I was reading the book. And I always wondered about the Braddock fight. It's kind of in boxing lore now, the great upset and everything. But you dedicate a whole chapter to the fight with Braddock, and you uncovered some really interesting things about Max Baer's hands and then something else related to what we were just talking about. Tell us that story. What do you think happened that night in 1935 in the fight against Braddock?
Well, I try to be fair with all the facts and put everything in the book factually so that people can draw their own opinions. Those are the facts as I uncovered them. I try to uncover everything I can. As you know, that I had to cut 30,000 words out of that book because publisher even said, Colleen, you can't go that long. I begged and pleaded, and they said that was probably the last of the longest books they would publish. But I wanted to get in everything I could. So I personally feel that it was a fix. I have no doubt in my mind that was a setup to get rid of Max Baer. So the things that led up to the Braddock fight. Now, Braddock was known to be a wash-up fighter. Yes, he was a good fighter, as all the men were in the 1930s. You have no slackers in the 1930s at any of those levels. But Braddock was never in the elimination bouts. When Max couldn't fight defense fights because Jimmy Johnson was trying to pad his wallet with all the elimination fights that he wanted. Braddock was never in those elimination bouts to even be a contender for Max. And then I think what was really important, again, because of the historic context, you have to look at it. And sometimes people don't look after the facts to see the research material. But Lasky was a big role in that ultimately led me to believe that these were all the shenanigans that were a part of the Bears' loss to Braddock. So Lasky was owned by Jimmy Johnston. Now remember, Max Baer did not go over to Jimmy Johnston, and Jimmy Johnston was livid. He wanted to take over Max Baer. He wanted to buy him out, and he even went to the Levinsky fight that I was telling you about in 1935 to even woo back Max Baer and to try to get a hold of Joe Louis, because Joe Louis was also fighting in Chicago then. And Max read Jimmy Johnston the riot act in the dressing room in front of everybody. And Max said, "You own Lasky and you're pairing up Lasky and Braddock. Everybody knows what you're doing." So that is an indication to me that Baer knew that was going to be a setup. Braddock beat Lasky. And people pretty much accept that in most of the historical writings and modern ones, that Braddock beat Lasky. Lasky confessed later on that was a fixed fight, that he agreed to lose to Braddock because Jimmy Johnson needed Braddock as a contender for Max Baer, because he could control Braddock and he certainly could control Lasky because he had his contract. So then that's how Braddock became a contender for Baer. Now, Baer does injure his hands in a fight with Eddie Sims, the last fight in an exhibition before he meets Braddock. But Braddock, and 5 days before the Braddock fight, Max's hands are inspected by the doctor for that fight, William Walker. And the doctor only minimally referred to his hands as being bruised. Max had been working with his hands since the injury from the Sims fight, and Max was boxing. His hands were taped. His hands were wrapped. I was looking at every, one of those in his camp and his sparring partners. I never saw anything different. Now, he had complained about his hands, and even one of the trainers said, "Oh, don't be a baby. Your hands are fine." So trainers looked at him. Ansel Hoffman looked at him. No one really thought much about his hands going into that fight. The day he goes in to have his hands wrapped, his hands are a mess. Ansel Hoffman leaves to go see Braddock's hands wrapped to inspect that. When he comes back, Max has the hand wrappings off, and he can't stand the touch of the tape on his hands. Max's hands were a mess. Then we know that Ansel said somebody stole his fighter the night before. So then now I go research what was Max doing the night before the fight. He had stayed at Leo Freedy's house, a big sport in New York, but he'd stayed there before the Carnera fight. So that was suspect to me, not from Leo Freedy's point of view, but Leo Freedy loved parties and all of that. It was told in the press that somebody had taken Max for a ride that night. Max even admitted that he had done a turn for his, quote, Broadway friends. Well, who were these Broadway friends? The references to all Broadway friends were to the bars on Broadway, to the mob-owned people. So, was Max taken for a ride? What happened at Leo Freedy's house that damaged his hands? Did Mary Kirk Brown stay overnight with him that night, and did he stay up too late with his girlfriend? He always had a girlfriend for every fight. If Mary Kirk Brown was there, what happened? Max never had a problem fighting the day after being with a woman, so I sort of counted that out. I asked my contacts in the underworld that knew something about mobster activity in those years, and I said, and I looked at Max's x-rays after the fight, and sure enough, the greatest damage on his hands, they were tremendously damaged, but it was on the top of his hands where the bones protrude. And I asked, how did the mob break hands in those days? And the common, maybe everyone knows this, but being the naive little old woman, I did not, but they put your hands in a window seal and slam the window down. And that would account exactly for the damage done across the top of Max's hands.
Oh.
Was Max threatened? I believe he was threatened that night. Mobsters were always coming in, trying to break into the dressing rooms. That had happened for the Carnera fight. Ansel came in and had to shoo the mobsters away. So was there mob activity and involvement? Was he threatened? I believe he was, because Max clearly gave away the first 5 rounds of the Braddock fight. Was that a condition for some reason? I think it was. There's so many activities with the mob. Mansell Hoffman's house was burned down later. Max was living there at the time. So there were a lot of activities that add up to the fact that fight wasn't on the level. And I also knew that if Max hadn't beaten Carnero, hadn't dropped him, Ansel Hoffman had people. I'm switching back now to the Carnera fight, but Max wasn't able to defend his title before Braddock. So the year before, in '34, Ansel Hoffman had men positioned to grab the judges' scorecards because he believed that fight was not on the level. And sure enough, they stole them. Ansel Hoffman had evidence, even with Arthur Donovan, without going into all the Arthur Donovan, he was the referee, and Max would have lost that on that Carnera fight on the scorecards, which is difficult to believe, but that's what would have happened on the scorecards. So I did uncover that, the fact that Ansel had those scorecards stolen. Was he able to do it for the Braddock fight? No, people had heads up on that now, and he couldn't do that. But I believe that the scorecards, that obviously the people were influenced. Ansel Hoffman demanded that Art Donovan be taken out as referee for the Braddock fight, and that infuriated Jim. Actually, that happened. McAvoy got in there, but I believe that if you, and I would invite anybody, look at that fight, look at the footage of the Braddock fight and score it on your own without a voiceover. And that started it. I knew that that Braddock fight wasn't on the level. My father suspected it always, and felt so bad for Max for losing that. And but my dad also had come up against the mob when he was fighting in New Orleans, so they all knew that the mob affected those fights. Hope that helps.
Wow, what a story, geez. Yeah, and then 3 months later, amazingly enough, he's back in the ring and he faces the Brown Bomber, Joe Louis.
Boom.
Yeah, and that's
boom. How's that for a comeback fight? Joe Louis.
3 months later, yeah, you're thrown in there against Joe Louis. And that fight is also controversial. And this is, you were talking about his yellow streak, and I believe that's where it started, where people accused him of quitting in the ring that night. What did you uncover, and what have you always thought about that fight when you watched it, you read about it, you researched it? What do you think happened?
Well, in the fight with Joe Louis, remember now, let's look at who owns the fighters. So Max couldn't get any more fights in New York. So Ansel Hoffman has to sign Max with Mike Jacobs, the owner of the 20th Century Sporting Club. And Max and Mike Jacobs is a foe of Jimmy Johnston. So Jimmy Johnston has Braddock and Schmeling, and Mike Jacobs owns Baer, Carnera, Lewis, and Lasky, because Lasky jumped ship from Jimmy Johnston to go over with Mike Jacobs because, Johnston got rid of him after he outed, the fixed fight with Braddock. So there's no one left for, really, if you can't get a fight, Mike Jacobs has Lewis, and Lewis is huge. So 1935, Max was a big star up to 1935. After 1935, Joe Louis was on the scene. But Jimmy Johnson didn't have Joe Louis. In fact, Jimmy Johnson turned down Joe Louis. Why did he turn down Joe Louis originally? Because Joe Louis wouldn't agree to lose fights for him. And so that's why, he never had control of Louis. But he wanted to give Braddock and Louis the opportunity to fight, but they couldn't agree on terms. So they needed money for big fights, and Max was still a huge draw, and so was Joe Louis. And so the 1935 fight with Joe Louis was the highest, it was the $1 million fight of the Depression. And so that was huge. That was such a big fight. It was the second fight of the year, actually, by Ring Magazine for Max Baer. And so, there's Joe Louis. They're each supposed to split 30% of a $300,000 fight. They would each get of $1 million fight, 30% would be about $300,000. Interestingly enough, Mike Jacobs gives Max only $150,000 for that fight because he said that was what he agreed to on a guarantee, and Mike Jacobs took the balance of Max's earnings in that. Dempsey here's what I think. Dempsey comes in and after the loss to Braddock says he has to retrain Max in his style. So he trains Max in a Dempsey crouch. Well, what does that do? That exposes chin. Max never fought in a crouch like that. He tried to fight twice in that. So I think his chin was exposed. We also know that Max couldn't wear the special gloves that he always wore or wanted to wear into the ring to protect his broken thumb. So Louis was allowed, if they let Max wear those gloves into the ring that were made by Saul Levinson out of San Francisco. And by the way, those are the same gloves similar gloves that he gave my dad in '34. So I know all about those gloves because I have the same pair that Saul Levinson made for Max. So I know how those were fitted. But Louis was allowed 12 feet of hand wrap in the bandages instead of 6 feet, and 6 feet of tape instead of 2 feet. Baer was knocked down 3 times and KO'd in the 4th. He didn't quit. Even Jim Braddock said that he watched that film 27 times and Louis hit Baer 22 times in the second round. That tells you what kind of chin he had. But writers called Max yellow. He was down on the ground. It was the first time he was laid on the canvas. Really, you know what did Max in? Hemingway did Max in. And I had loved, I was raised with a background in literature, American lit, and Hemingway had always been a hero to me in writing. I'd written many, many papers on Hemingway. And after I found what Hemingway did to Max Baer in Esquire magazine in 1935, titling it The $1 Million Fright, calling Max yellow, and that article, he so slammed Max, calling him, the butcher was butchered, calling him, a steer to the slaughter. And that's really what labeled Max as yellow. I think it was Hemingway more than anything.
Mm. Wow.
Louis was made heavyweight of the year that year, 1935, and Baer, as a result, was called the greatest disappointment of the year. But interestingly enough, by the next year, Max is back in the top 10. And why? Because Max is a draw. At that point on, they wanted him in Europe, and the story picks up momentum again, and Max Baer again becomes a hero, even after losing to Joe Louis. The point of that I'd like to make is that the fight with Max's fight with Joe Louis in 1935 had a bigger gate than Lewis's fight with Schmeling in '38, when everybody was looking at him, as the killer of the Nazi German world.
You just alluded to that. He beat Max Schmeling 2 years before he fought Joe Louis. He scored a technical knockout in Yankee Stadium. How important was that to Max Baer's career?
That was huge because Max Schmeling was trying to, as I've always said, the 30s were all of the contenders trying to take over the matches. So there was very little room for new contenders to come up when all the old champions were there trying to win elimination bouts and doing their exhibitions and trying to become contenders again. So Max Schmeling was trying to regain the title because that was, everyone thought that was strange, with Sharkey and Schmeling, and then Schmeling and Sharkey, and so Max was trying to win back the title. And when Max Baer beat him, that was the first time Max was in the Fight of the Year. That was another Ring Fight of the Year fight, 33. So Baer had two, one with Max Schmeling in 33 and one in 35 with Joe Louis. And that, incidentally, is where Max became known. There was nothing about Jewish background for Max until 1933. And that's when he, Jack Dempsey had promoted that fight. And Jack Dempsey was on the outs with New York. And Ansel Hoffman had already gone over and paid Schmeling $100,000 because that's what his manager, Joe Jacobs, had to pay Schmeling each year, $100,000. So that's how, through Ansel's paying him $100,000 to get that fight, that's how that fight occurred. And then Hitler wanted to thank Ansel Hoffman and Max Baer for making that fight and bringing Max Schmeling back into prominence. And Hitler would have never entertained Ansel Hoffman and Max Baer if he thought that they were Jewish. But nevertheless, there was this thought in the family that Ashel Baer had been Jewish, so that would allow Baer to claim 0.25% of Jewish. I could never find that in the records, but nevertheless, Bill McCarney was the one who came up with the idea. Tickets weren't selling, and Ansel already paid $100,000, and Jack Dempsey was, trying to run that fight. Jack Dempsey wanted to have that fight with Schmeling in Chicago in 1933, and guess what? The mayor wanted that fight there because it was the World's Fair. It seemed logical, and Dempsey wasn't connected to Chicago, but the mayor was shot and killed in Miami, and so that ruined there's another, Miami connection there, and so the fight had to be moved to New York. Now, in New York, a tremendously large population of Jews supported the fights and were involved in the fights, and it was a huge population, the Jewish population, and they weren't buying any tickets because if you think about it logically, you've got two German fighters. You've got Max Baer, German, fighting another German from Germany, and at that point, it's 33, it's early. The American public wasn't as attuned to the situation in Europe as the Jews were in New York, so they weren't going to go to support any German fighters. And that's when Bill McCarney came up with the idea of having a Jewish versus German bout. And McCarney talked about that later in later years. And Max and Ansel was probably more Jewish than Baer was, if either were Jewish. And Ansel didn't know anything about Judaism, so he agreed to go hire a rabbi, and whenever they walked around and met the press in New York, they had a rabbi there so that the rabbi could answer any Jewish questions for them. But nevertheless, it was extremely popular when the Jews came out to support Max Baer, and then Max Baer really was the hero for the Jews, and quite legitimately so.
Who did Max date from the Hollywood world that you uncovered? He was considered quite a ladies' man, I believe. I think I remember him. Didn't he go out with Jean Harlow or something, or try to go out with Jean Harlow during that period?
He went out with all of them, and
he did.
And he was really the young playboy, and all of this was really before the Lewis fight in 35. All of that playboy status, because he married after the Braddock fight. he married Mary Ellen Sullivan, a waitress at the Willard Hotel in D.C., and that was only 5 days after he'd lost the title to Braddock. So his playful days were over, but there were always funny stories I found about, Mae West inviting him up to come see him sometime, and him having to get permission from Ansel, and because Ansel was sick of it all. He married Dorothy Dunbar, and I happened in Albuquerque to find a descendant of Dunbar's ex-husband, so that was quite informing for me. And so, he was, and once he was making movies, they loved him. I mean, here was a virile man. You have to just look at any picture of Max and see that he was charming. He really was a ladies' man. He was, he was charming, a gentleman. He looked great. Every actress who was probably averaging, 5'6", at that time. You can see what those little dancers were in Prize Fighter and a lady next to this behemoth, 6'2" Max Baer. But he was a gentleman. He could cook. He was a butcher. He could cook. He was intelligent. He was so smart. And humorous, and his humor was just funny. So everybody loved him. Everyone wanted to be seen on his arm, and he certainly enjoyed that. I mean, if you were 21, would you enjoy that?
You alluded earlier to his son, Max Baer Jr., who also had a Hollywood career, and those of us who are children of the 60s know all about this, especially if we're boxing fans. But go ahead and finish that story for us. Who was Max Baer Jr.?
Max Baer Jr. Wanted to be a boxer. In fact, at the end of Baer's life, Max Baer Jr. did fight in college. And Max Baer really didn't want him fighting. You could be a manager, yes, where all the money is, but, he was way too smart for that. And so he went directly into the movies. Now, the movie that you're alluding to is the Beverly Hillbillies. The TV series. Mm-hmm. And I think that ran for really over a decade, from 62 on. But he was Jethro in that. A big... the character was a dumb guy, a ladies' man, and the same character that Max Baer had. But, I'm assuming he was just as smart as his father. They both had the wits. Here's what I believe, though, that I've never really spoken a lot about. Max Baer was always coming up with these television dramas, and he always said, boy, had television been around when I was fighting, I would have looked up and smiled into that camera every single time. And he was quite witty, and he was always in so many of these preliminary promo television shows, in addition to the ones that, were already on. But he proposed so many. There was a show that he proposed that I think was where Friends came from. In a bar, Max was behind the bar telling all the stories, talking to the teenagers. Now, doesn't that sound familiar, Happy Days? That sounds like Happy Days to me. So if you think about Max Baer's history, here are hog farmers coming in this open truck across in 1922 to go to another cattle country, 6 of them sleeping overnight in this rickety old car trying to get to California. He actually buys his parents a mansion, but they are so uncomfortable in this mansion that he has to buy them a modest home where they're more comfortable. Doesn't this all sound like the script for the Beverly Hillbillies? Mm-hmm. And the hog, of course, they discovered oil on their Appalachian farm. But nevertheless, I have always wondered, and I would have liked to have asked Max, did you propose that idea for the Beverly Hillbillies? Because, again, Max Jr. was starring that in 62 and Max died in 59. So I wouldn't have been surprised if he proposed that show as well.
Colleen, were you able to interview Max Baer Jr. for this book? Did he talk to you?
I was not able to. I tried to reach him at his home in Reno, and I tried various avenues. I had reached other relatives, and they had all lost contact with him. And, and I know he wants to maintain his privacy, but I would love to be able to talk to him. I would hope that he would contact me through the publisher when he finds out about the book, because I think we have so much in common with our fathers, and I would love to tell him what my father said about his father, and I would love to know what he felt as well. And so I did not get a chance to do that. I hope that materializes in the future. And wouldn't that be great if we could get him on the phone?
Yep, sure would.
Yeah. Colleen, tell us about David W. Wallace, who we found out you know pretty well since he is your husband. How did he help, and how did you guys go about putting this book together?
Dave had never really been interested in boxing. That's my background, and he was an engineer his entire life, had to work. His father died young, and so he always had to be around boxing. When I wanted to watch a boxing match, he would watch it, and it took years and years to finally get him to want to watch boxing, and now he's an avid fan. And so we'd had some problems with both of my sons live here in Albuquerque, and Albuquerque had gone through quite a fit with oh my goodness, with crime, and both of them had been victims of home robberies, and my son was held at gunpoint. Not a very good advertising for Albuquerque, but so I had taken a step back, and Dave said, "What are you going to do that Max Baer book? You know you've written up to it at that point, because Tex Rickard stops in 1929. Dempsey is his manager, and then Dempsey now takes over Max Baer. So it was the perfect, chronology for me to pick back up. And I like to do decades at a time, obviously. And so I said, okay, but this is going to take a lot of work, and I have to devote a year to writing. It takes me a year to write a book, and that's not research time. So Dave and I set up shop on the second floor up here. We had 4 computer screens, and he said, okay, I'm committed to, and he was really pushing me to get through this book. And McLaughlin was wanting the book, had wanted it for a long time. And I said, okay, but it's going to be long. And McLaughlin said, no, shorten it. So that was going on as well. But I sat in my chair for 9 months. I said, it's like birthing a baby. From the time I woke up to the time I went to bed, and that's during the night, you always wake up, you think of something. So I literally sat in that chair for 9.5 months. I was on a computer and had 2 screens, and Dave was on another 2 computers, and he was doing the research. So he did all of the research for me, and that's why it came together in just 1 year, because it would have taken, and I really started at 3 years, but it really took a year to write, with both of us working, almost full-time for him. And so I would say, oh, God, here's what I found. Now go find me this. Go, Colleen, you can't find that. Yes, you can, Dave. Go find it. Go look here. Go look there. And so he was absolutely great. And being an engineer, he wasn't going to, lose any document or, fail to dot an I or cross a T. So it was extremely helpful. I can tell you that his expertise is really more in football, and so it was funny when he came out and he said, oh, look at this football game. They all attended this football game, and look who scored the such and such and such. And I said, look, I have to cut out words here. We are not going to talk about football. I barely was able to talk about baseball and a little bit of golf, a few words about golf. And so he said, well, there are more readers of football than there are of boxing. And I said, look, this is a boxing book. We're going to stick with boxing, and hopefully we'll make more readers of boxing than football.
Right.
Okay, so last question for you. What's next? Is there another boxing book?
Oh, I knew you were going to ask me that. I knew, I had my dream come true. Really, truly, this is my heart book. And I just want, and I know you know that, both of you guys know that. This is my heart. You read that. I wanted people to feel what it was like, to feel the frustrations, the anger, and that Max made it through this, and what made him just such a great figure and hope for the 30s, that bright light on that really drab face. So I'd really planned to, end my boxing writing with that. I've been asked to write some articles, and then there's some other people that wanted a biography, and so I'm really just sort of still mulling it over because I have to have a really good idea in my mind before I really, really commit. And, you know, these have been great figures. I've been blessed to be able to write the Joe Gans book with Mark Scott. We were friends back since '85. He was a Golden Gloves boxer. And then the Rickard book, which is now, that's the rights have been purchased for a television series called The Sport. You never know if that's going to make, because you never know. But that would be such a great history as well. And then, like I said, the chronology. So I'm going to ask you two, who would you like to see written about? I'll turn the table on this.
Who would you love to see?
You know, right now there's so many boxing books out there. When Mark and I started writing, you know, Clay Moyle was the only other one that was writing about Langford. And now there are just so many boxing books out there. So we really are getting a really good history of boxing now. And really, truly, I started on George Dixon, and then someone was doing their dissertation out of Canada on it, and I never want to step in the path of someone trying to do a dissertation, and then some other interest. But I never saw that materialize. So, but anyway, so I'll ask you.
I'd like to see a book on Ray Arcel. That's who I'd like to see. Legendary.
Wow.
Yeah, Ray Arcel. Yeah,
how good. I never thought about, you know, I try to always put in the trainers. And for this book, I really tried to put in the sparring partners because people like my father, you know, my father cut off his left thumb. Here he is trying to make a living, you know, as an orthodox fighter without a left thumb. Oh, my gosh. You feel so sorry for the sparring partners, the journeymen. But then, like trainer, Ray Arcel. You know, Ray Arcel was big friends with Max Baer.
I believe that.
Yeah. I got a couple.
Hey, the book is The Magnificent Max Baer, The Life of the Heavyweight Champion and Film Star. The author is Colleen Aycock with a big helping hand from her husband, David Wallace, the researcher. And she's also written about Joe Gans and Tex Rickard, and you can find them all on Amazon or anywhere fine books are sold. Colleen, congratulations on another great job and just tremendous research on this. Best of luck with a great new book. And thanks for spending some time with us today on the Ringside Boxing Show. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, well, I really want to thank you both because this has been really my pleasure. Like I said, my heart is on the line with every word here. And you guys have been so great to allow me to talk so long, and I really do appreciate it.
That was wonderful. Fascinating stuff, Colleen. Thank you so much.
We loved it. Thanks. Colleen Aycock on the Ringside Boxing Show, everybody. Thanks, Colleen. If you haven't yet discovered the #1 website in the world for daily boxing news, and by the way, you'll find a John Responti's review of this book on this website, what are you waiting for? We update RingsideBoxingShow.com 365 days a year with the hottest stories and biggest headlines every single day. If you're a fight fan, this should be your first stop every morning, and it might be the only website you need to visit all day. Discover us right now, and you will be amazed, guaranteed. RingsideBoxingShow.com, and you can find John Responti's review of this book on that website right now. Thanks as always to our expert analysts Travis Hartman, Rizwan Zahid, and my partner John J. Responti. Thanks to our outstanding British correspondent Paul McLaughlin, and another huge thanks today to Colleen Aycock, the author of a terrific new biography of former heavyweight champion and Hollywood star Max Baer. Finally, we appreciate you, Ringside Nation, for being a part of our worldwide audience today. Keep your chin tucked, and we'll talk to you again next week on the Ringside Boxing Show.
Well, it's a great day for me to whoop somebody's ass. It's a bad day, so you better get off of my back, 'cause you might get cold cocked if you cross my path.